Welcome back to Twisted Roots, where we tell the kinds of family stories that cut deep, twist hard, and sometimes heal in unexpected ways. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because each story might just remind you of someone in your own life. Story title: My grandson pushed me into the lake, but what happened next shocked the whole family. It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday by the lake. The sun hung low, shimmering on the water like scattered coins, and the breeze carried the smell of pine needles and summer dust. Families came here for picnics, to let the kids splash around, to let the old ones breathe a little fresh air. And I, an old man with knees that no longer trusted the earth, was just grateful to be included. You see, when you're past 70, invitations aren't given so easily anymore. People assume you're too slow, too fragile, too much trouble. So when my daughter suggested I come along, I said yes, even though I could already hear the quiet sighs in her voice. At the picnic table, I sat with my grandson, 15 tall, full of restless energy, the kind of energy that doesn't know yet how cruel it can be. He looked at me not with affection, but with impatience, as if my very presence were an interruption to his youth. "Come on, Grandpa," he said, loud enough for the others to laugh. "Don't fall asleep on us here." I smiled, because that's what old men do. We turn insults into chuckles, hoping they sting less that way. But deep inside, the words settled heavy like stones sinking into the lake itself. Later, as we walked along the wooden dock, I tried to keep pace. My cane clicked against the planks. He kept glancing back, grinning in a way I didn't recognize, sharp, mischievous, almost daring. And then, without warning, his hands pressed hard against my back. The water rose up fast, cold, unforgiving. My breath caught as the lake swallowed me whole. For a moment, silence, only the shock of betrayal ringing louder than the splash itself. I thought, so this is what it means when a generation forgets to honor the one before it. What happened after would not only change my family, it would awaken an entire community. The lake had settled again, as if nothing had happened, but inside me something had shifted. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with a storm. Sometimes it slips into your life in broad daylight, hidden beneath the laughter of your own family. That evening we gathered around the picnic table, plates stacked with grilled corn, potato salad, and ribs that smelled of hickory smoke. To anyone passing by, we looked like a portrait of American family life, sunburned cheeks. The clatter of forks and voices overlapping in casual conversation. But beneath the chatter was something else, something sharp. "Grandpa nearly fell into the lake today," my grandson announced, though we both knew the truth. His words floated over the table like smoke, curling into every ear. The laughter started with a chuckle, then grew louder, rolling like an unkind wave. "Old man's legs can't keep up anymore. Maybe next time we need to tie a rope to him. Just in case, better yet, get him a life jacket for dessert." Even my own children joined in, smiling tightly, as if making light of me kept them from facing the cruelty of it all. I chewed slowly, each bite turning to ash. My fork felt heavy, my hands heavier. You know what it is to sit among your blood, your legacy, and feel like the joke at the center of it all. I tried to smile, to laugh it off, because that is what is expected of old men. But my heart whispered something different. Respect is not a luxury. It is the last dignity the elderly can cling to. Across the table, I caught the eye of a neighbor who had joined us for the meal. She did not laugh. She looked at me the way one looks at a wounded animal torn between pity and anger. That gaze alone told me I was not entirely invisible. But to my family, I was fading, becoming less a person and more a burden. A tired old man who couldn't walk as fast, eat as quick, or matter as much. The ribs grew cold on my plate. Their jokes grew sharper. And somewhere inside me, a seed of silence was planted. A silence that would soon grow into something much louder than all their laughter combined. Because sometimes the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the voices you once taught how to speak. The sun was lowering now, turning the lake into a sheet of fire, orange and gold rippling across the water. Families nearby packed their coolers. Children licked the last of their ice cream cones. The world around us seemed content ordinary. But cruelty has a way of choosing the most ordinary moments. After dinner, my grandson wandered back toward the dock. His friends were waiting nearby, half watching, half daring him with their silence. I followed, cane tapping against the wood. Slow and careful with each step. Perhaps I should have stayed behind. Perhaps every old man knows when he has wandered too far into a place that no longer welcomes him. He turned to me, his young face lit by a grin that was not joy but something else, mischief sharpened into malice. "Come on, Grandpa," he said, mocking the tremor in my steps. "Don't trip now." The boys laughed, not loud, but enough. Laughter, you see, is the kindling of cruelty. It gives permission. It pushes the line further. And then, without warning, without hesitation, his hands pressed hard into my back. The world tilted, my cane slipped from my grasp. For an instant, the dock disappeared and the lake rose up to claim me. The cold bit into my skin like broken glass, a shock so fierce it stole the breath from my chest. I sank heavy with years, my clothes pulling me down. Above the waterline, I could see their faces blurred in the shimmering air, my family. My blood, eyes wide, mouths open, frozen between horror and denial. Some gasped, some laughed nervously as if still unsure whether this was a joke or a crime. But not one hand reached for me. Not yet. I kicked, flailed, my lungs begging for air. The lake swallowed my cries. All I could think was how strange it was, that after a lifetime of raising children, working 2 jobs, building a home brick by brick, I would end up like this, sinking not because of fate, but because of the very hands of the future I had once dreamed for. My grandson's hands. It is a particular kind of pain to realize betrayal has weight, and that weight is enough to drown you. And yet somewhere in the blur of water and panic, I heard another sound, a splash not my own, a voice not born of cruelty but of urgency. Someone else had moved, someone had leapt into the water. And that, as you will see, was the beginning of everything that came after. The water had claimed me for what felt like an eternity before a stranger's arms pulled me back toward the dock. My chest burned, my body shook, and when my head finally broke the surface, the evening air rushed in like knives. I coughed, sputtering like water, clinging to the rough planks as I was dragged to shore. My cane floated away somewhere behind me, lost to the current. And then came the silence, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it condemns. My family stood on the dock, their figures outlined against the fading sun. Some covered their mouths, but not out of horror, out of embarrassment. Embarrassment that I had made a scene. Embarrassment that the neighbors had seen. "Well, Dad," my daughter forced a nervous laugh. "You always wanted to cool off." Laughter, thin, uneasy, but it was there. My son-in-law shook his head and muttered, "It was just a prank, don't take it so seriously." A prank. That word hung in the air heavier than the water in my lungs. I searched their faces for something, concern, regret, even anger at the boy who had pushed me, but what I found instead was avoidance. Eyes darting away, hands busying themselves with plates and napkins. One of them even reached for another rib as if filling the stomach might drown out the shame. And my grandson, he stood tall, arms crossed, his smirk fading into something harder, colder, not fear, not guilt. Defiance. The stranger who had pulled me from the lake shook his head in disbelief. "You people aren't going to check on him?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. But no one answered. Silence, awkward, suffocating silence, the kind that makes your heart colder than the water ever could. I wrapped the towel someone finally tossed me around my shoulders, shivering, not from the lake, but from the realization that in that moment, among my own flesh and blood, I was not a grandfather, not a father, not even a man. I was an inconvenience, a spectacle. And that silence, that terrible silence, was louder than the splash that had nearly ended me. Because sometimes betrayal doesn't scream, it whispers in the quiet when no one chooses to speak for you. When the water closed over my head, I thought that was the end of it. A 70-year-old man, lungs weak, legs heavy, dignity already drowned long before the lake had a chance to take me. But fate, it seems, had placed another set of hands nearby that day. Not the hands of my family, not the hands of my grandson, but the hands of a stranger. He was a jogger, mid-30s, sweat-soaked, earbuds still dangling as he sprinted down the pier. He didn't hesitate. While my family froze, whispering excuses about just a prank, this stranger leapt. His body cut through the water like an arrow, and in a moment I felt his arm lock around my chest, pulling me upward, dragging me back toward the dock. When my head broke the surface, air came like fire. I coughed and coughed, clinging to him like a newborn clings to life. He pulled me ashore, kneeling, pressing a towel against me that someone finally handed over. And that's when I noticed something else, something almost invisible at first. A teenager standing nearby with a phone. She had recorded the whole thing, the shove, the fall, the silence, the rescue. And within minutes, while I still trembled on the dock, water dripping from my hair, that video found its way to the endless scroll of the internet. By nightfall, my face, wrinkled, pale, shaking under the weight of a towel, had been replayed thousands of times. My grandson's smirk was frozen in frame, his push undeniable. and the sound that echoed louder than the splash was the silence of my family doing nothing. At the dinner table, they had mocked me. At the dock, they had abandoned me. But in the digital square of the modern world, strangers saw something different. They didn't see a burden, they saw betrayal. And betrayal, once revealed, cannot be buried. That night, shivering not from cold, but from shame and disbelief, I realized something. My family's silence had been terrifying, but the voice of the world outside, that was about to become deafening. That night, after the lake had gone still and the jogger had long since disappeared, we gathered back at the cabin. The smell of wet towels lingered in the air. My clothes clung damp against my skin, though they had handed me a blanket. I thought, perhaps naively, that there might be an apology, a moment of remorse. A whispered "we're sorry" slipped into the shadows of the evening, but remorse never came, only excuses. "You're too sensitive, Dad," my daughter finally said, her voice carrying the kind of brittle edge that hides discomfort. "It was just a prank," my son-in-law added, shaking his head as if the problem wasn't the push, but my reaction to it. Even my grandson muttered under his breath, "He should have just laughed, that's all." Laughed at nearly drowning, at being shoved into icy water by the same boy I once carried on my shoulders to feed ducks at this very lake. I sat in my chair, silent. Crackle of the fireplace was louder than their words, yet each sentence landed on me heavier than stones. "Dad, you're making this into something bigger than it is," my daughter continued. "People joke, things happen. Why are you turning this into a tragedy?" I wanted to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. What words could I choose? That the real tragedy wasn't the water, but the silence. That what had drowned me wasn't the lake, but the absence of their love. So I said nothing. I looked at their faces, the faces I had worked for, sacrificed for, grown old for, and for the first time in my life I felt like an outsider in my own family. The jogger had saved my body, but no one in that room tried to save my heart. And in that quiet moment, as they went on debating whether I had overreacted, I felt something inside me break, not with sound, but with finality. Because sometimes the cruelest wound isn't made by water or stone. It's made by the people you love most when they choose to call your pain an inconvenience. That night I sat alone, listening to their voices fade into the walls of the cabin, and my silence was not forgiveness, it was survival. By morning the world was no longer quiet. The video, grainy, shaky, filmed by the teenager on her phone, had already traveled faster than any apology ever could. It began as a clip shared among friends, then neighbors, and by the time the sun rose, it had leapt onto social platforms with captions that carried more weight than any judge's gavel. "Grandson pushes his own grandfather into the lake. Where has respect gone? Is this what family means now?" The comments poured in like a flood no one could hold back. "I don't know this man, but my God, my heart broke watching him fall. This isn't just a prank, it's abuse, plain and simple. Someone check on him, and someone teach that boy what honor means." By noon the clip had crossed state lines. By evening it had crossed oceans. People from places I had never set foot in, New York, London, Manila, were speaking my name, or at least the name they gave me, Grandpa by the lake. And here was the irony. The family that once laughed at me now flinched when the phone rang. Reporters called. Local radio wanted a statement. A pastor from a church I had never attended asked if he could pray for me on air. My grandson, once so smug, was now haunted at school. His classmates whispered, pointing, their words sharper than the ones he had once thrown at me. "There goes the kid who shoved his own grandfather." But it wasn't just him. My daughter, my son-in-law, they could not walk into the grocery store without feeling eyes on their backs, hearing the hush of voices behind them. The community that once looked away now refused to. The silence of my family had been terrifying, but the noise of the world outside was deafening. And yet, amid the outrage, there was something else: kindness. Letters arrived. Strangers sent blankets, books, even a cane carved by a craftsman who said, "This one won't slip away from you." Neighbors knocked on the door, bringing soup and apologies, not for what they had done, but for what they had allowed themselves to ignore. The irony of the digital age is this: sometimes it takes millions of strangers to remind your own blood of what family really means. That night, as I sat by the window watching the glow of the phone screen light up with notifications, I realized something. The lake had not only swallowed me, it had spilled my family's truth into the world. And now, the world was watching. By the second morning, the story had already leaked from the glow of phone screens into the air of the neighborhood. Murphy's Diner, the place where gossip traveled faster than coffee refills, hummed with my name. Did you see it, that poor old man in the lake? I can't believe his own grandson pushed him. Family or not, someone ought to teach that boy a lesson. The whispers moved from the diner to the post office, from the post office to the church steps, and soon those whispers became knocks on my front door. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived 2 houses down for as long as I could remember, showed up first. She carried a basket of muffins, but her face carried something heavier, anger. "Don't you worry, Mr. Harlan," she said, her voice firm. "Folks saw the video. We know what happened. You're not alone in this." Later, Mr. Lewis, the retired mechanic, came by, shaking his head. "Raised my grandkids myself," he muttered. "If one of 'em ever laid a hand on me like that, Lord help 'em, you deserved better." It struck me then how quickly shame spreads in a small town. Yesterday I had been the butt of jokes at my own family's table. Today I was the subject of pity, even outrage. But unlike the silence that followed my fall into the lake, these voices refused to stay quiet. At church on Sunday, the stares were sharper. My daughter and her husband shifted uncomfortably in the pews while murmurs rolled behind them like a tide. How could they let it happen? How could they laugh about it? And my grandson, once so proud, so untouchable, couldn't meet a single pair of eyes. The truth was out now, not because I had spoken it, but because the community had chosen to. The lake had swallowed my dignity for a moment, but the people who had watched the video, who whispered my story across fences and sidewalks, were giving it back to me in pieces. Whispers, after all, can grow, and soon they would no longer be whispers at all, because in small towns, justice does not always begin in courtrooms. Sometimes it begins on front porches with neighbors who refuse to look away. By Monday morning, the story had traveled from the living room screens of strangers into the hallways of my grandson's school. Teenagers, who usually cared more about sneakers, music, and weekend plans, suddenly had a new subject, one that carried the weight of both cruelty and shame. As he walked down the corridor, backpack slung over one shoulder, the whispers began. "There he is, Lake Boy. No, not Lake Boy, bad grandson." Laughter trailed behind him. But it wasn't the triumphant kind he had enjoyed when shoving me into the water. This was different. It was sharp, mocking, a mirror held up to his own cruelty. At lunch, he sat at his usual table, but the seats around him remained empty. His friends, the same ones who had chuckled nervously on the dock, avoided his gaze now. They had seen the comments online. They had read the captions that called him the boy who pushed blood into water. To be seen with him now was to share in his shame. One girl finally spoke, her voice steady but cold. "My grandpa raised me after my mom left. If I ever did to him what you did, I couldn't live with myself." Her words cut deeper than any teacher's lecture could. By afternoon, even the teachers knew. Some avoided the topic, but their eyes said enough. A math teacher handed back his homework with a sigh, muttering, "You need to think about your choices, son." Every step my grandson took that day was haunted by a new name echoing in the halls. Ungrateful, unworthy, unfit. At home, he tried to brush it off. "They're just jealous," he muttered, slamming his door, but deep inside he felt it, the shift. The power he thought he had wielded over me had collapsed, replaced with a label he could not wash away. The internet had judged him, his peers had sentenced him. And though I had said nothing, though I had kept my silence, the world had begun to speak for me, because sometimes punishment does not come from the law. Sometimes it comes from the voices of your own generation, refusing to let cruelty pass as a joke. The storm outside was growing louder, neighbors whispering, classmates condemning, strangers online demanding justice. But inside our home there was a different kind of storm, not one of truth, but one of excuses. That evening my daughter sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her husband pacing behind her. Their boy, the same boy who had shoved me into the lake, was upstairs, sulking in his room, headphones drowning out the noise of the world. "Dad," my daughter began. Choosing her words carefully, "We need to talk about this situation." Situation, that's what they called it, as if nearly drowning your grandfather were no more than a scheduling conflict. She sighed, folding her hands. "This whole thing, it's gotten out of control. People online don't understand context. They don't know him the way we do." Her husband chimed in, his voice sharper. "It was a prank, for God's sake. A stupid mistake, sure, but kids make mistakes. And now social media has blown it into something bigger. They're making him out to be some kind of monster." I sat silently, listening to the words twist themselves into knots. They weren't talking about my pain or my dignity or even the water that had filled my lungs. They were talking about image, about damage control. "He's a good kid," my daughter insisted. "He gets good grades. He tries too hard sometimes to impress his friends." I wanted to ask, and does impressing his friends require pushing his grandfather into a lake? But my voice stayed locked in my chest. Years of swallowing words had trained me well. Then came the part that cut the deepest. "You're making this worse, Dad," my son-in-law said, pointing at me. "If you'd laugh it off, let it go, people would stop talking. But instead, your silence makes it look serious. You're feeding the drama." I stared at him, wondering if he could hear himself. Feeding the drama, as though my near drowning was a performance staged for the world's entertainment, as though my pain existed only in how it was perceived by strangers. They weren't defending their son. They were defending themselves from shame, from judgment, from accountability. The truth is, when a family chooses to protect its image over its integrity, something sacred dies. And that night, as their words wrapped tighter around excuses, I felt that death. I had once believed silence was survival, but listening to their justifications, I realized silence was also complicity. Because sometimes the most dangerous betrayal isn't the shove into the water. It's the hand that refuses to pull you back out, choosing instead to point fingers while you drown. By the third day, the whispers of neighbors and the fury of strangers online were no longer enough to contain the storm. It had reached the ears of people who carried microphones, cameras, and the insatiable hunger of headlines. The knock came mid-morning, firm, polite, but unrelenting. "Mr. Harland, we're with Channel 7 News. Could we have a moment of your time?" Through the window, I saw them, a cameraman adjusting his lens, a young reporter clutching her notepad, and a van parked at the curb with the station's logo blazoned across its side. My daughter paled. My son-in-law muttered a curse under his breath. "Don't say a word," he warned. "This family doesn't need more spectacle." But it was too late for that. The spectacle had already been made, by their silence, by his shove, by the phone that had captured it all. I opened the door, blanket still draped over my shoulders, and the young reporter's eyes softened as she saw me. "Sir," she began gently, "we'd like to hear your side of what happened." For a long moment I didn't speak. I looked back at my family, my daughter's desperate shake of the head, my grandson's footsteps thudding angrily upstairs. Then I looked at the reporter, and I told the truth. I spoke not with anger, but with the weight of years. I described the dock, the shove, the water colder than any winter I had known. I told her of the silence on the shore, the laughter dressed up as excuses. "But how did it feel?" she asked quietly, microphone trembling in her hand. I hesitated, then said, "It felt like I stopped being family in that moment, not because I fell into the lake, but because no one reached out their hand to pull me back." The cameraman's eye behind the lens flickered. Even he, hardened by years of covering fires and car wrecks, seemed to pause. By evening, my words were on the 6 o'clock news. My face, lined, weary, still bruised by betrayal, appeared in living rooms across the state. The anchor spoke of a community divided, of questions about respect for elders, of the line between pranks and cruelty. And while my neighbors left pies and letters at my doorstep, my daughter slammed doors inside the house. My son-in-law barked into the phone at anyone who called. My grandson buried his shame under defiance, headphones glued tighter to his ears. What they feared most had come true. Our private shame was now public truth, and truth, once set loose, cannot be contained. That night, as the phones rang endlessly with reporters asking for more, I sat by the window once more. The glow of the television across the street told me the neighbors were watching too. The world was no longer laughing at me. It was asking questions of them, and questions, once asked, demand answers. By the end of that week, it was no longer just a story on the evening news. It had become a movement. The video of my fall into the lake had been shared, reposted, dissected on talk shows, debated on radio. But more than that, it had stirred something deeper, an old wound in the hearts of many who had watched quietly as their elders were dismissed, mocked, or forgotten. It began with a simple gesture. A neighbor's teenage daughter created an online petition. The title was sharp, undeniable. "Justice for Grandpa by the Lake, Stop Elder Abuse." Within hours, hundreds of signatures appeared. By morning, thousands. Each name carried a story in the comments. "This reminds me of how my uncle was treated. Never again." My grandmother raised me. To think anyone could laugh while she suffers breaks my heart. Respect for elders is the backbone of family. Without it, we are lost. The signatures were not just words. They were a wave, and that wave began to crash loudly against the walls of my own family's silence. Local organizations joined in. The town's senior advocacy group demanded accountability. Churches dedicated sermons to honoring thy father and mother and thy grandfather too. Even the mayor, pressed by growing public outrage, issued a statement: no community can thrive if it tolerates cruelty toward its elders. And then, the part that my daughter and her husband feared most, the calls for investigation. Child Protective Services, ironically, now being asked to look into the welfare of the elder in the family. Reporters camped outside our street, their cameras pointed not just at me, but at the closed blinds of my daughter's house. Inside those walls, tension snapped like brittle twigs. They're blowing this out of proportion, my son-in-law barked. This is harassment, my daughter cried. But their words had lost their grip, because when the world begins to see your silence as complicity, no excuse can quiet the noise. As for me, I sat quietly at the kitchen table, letter after letter piling up before me. Some came with shaky handwriting from hands older than mine, others with bold signatures from the young, vowing to do better than the generation before them. And in those letters, I found something my family had failed to give me that day at the lake: dignity. This was no longer just about me. It was about what kind of people we wanted to be, what kind of children we wanted to raise. The lake had taken my breath for a moment, but the world's outrage had given me a voice I never expected to have. And soon, that voice would grow louder than any silence my family could hide behind. The community center was full that evening. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor, the smell of coffee drifted from the back table, and voices buzzed in every corner. Neighbors, reporters, even strangers who had driven miles just to see for themselves the man from the video, all had gathered. I sat in the front row, hands folded on my cane, feeling smaller than ever under so many watchful eyes. My family sat a few rows back, stiff and uneasy, shifting in their seats as if the wood itself burned beneath them. When the mayor finally called my name, the room fell silent. I rose slowly, knees aching, each step echoing against the hush. I turned to face them, not just the neighbors, not just the cameras, but the people who had laughed when I was drowning, my family. I cleared my throat. My voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected. I want you all to know, I began, that I do not carry anger in my heart. I will not stand here and curse my grandson or raise my fist at my children. That is not who I am. The crowd shifted, confused. Some expected outrage, others expected demands. Instead, I offered something heavier. I am not angry, I said, pausing long enough for the silence to deepen. But I am sad because somewhere along the way, my family forgot two simple words, two words that build the foundation of every home: respect and dignity. A murmur rippled through the hall. I worked my whole life, I continued, not for wealth, not for recognition, but so my children could eat, so they could go to school, so they would never know the cold of hunger or the sting of abandonment. And yet, when I was pushed into that lake, it was not the water that hurt me. It was the silence of the people I love most. Standing on the shore, I felt my voice break then, not into anger, but into grief, the kind that comes only when disappointment has cut deeper than any blade. You see, I whispered, it's not drowning that breaks an old man's heart. It's realizing his family didn't reach for him. By then I saw tears in the eyes of strangers. Hardened men in work boots shifted uncomfortably, wiping their faces. Women clutched their children tighter. And even some who had come out of mere curiosity now lowered their heads, ashamed for reasons they couldn't quite name. I ended simply, with no grand speech, only this: I don't want revenge, I don't want punishment, I just want us to remember, respect is not a burden, it is a gift. And it is the last thing an old man has the right to ask for. When I stepped down, the room was silent still, but it was no longer the silence of neglect. It was the silence that comes when truth has finally pierced the heart. That night after the meeting at the community hall, the house no longer felt like a home. The air was thick, heavy with everything that had been spoken and everything that could no longer be ignored. The door slammed behind us as we returned. My daughter threw her purse onto the counter, her voice rising almost immediately. Why did you have to say all that, Dad, in front of everyone? Do you have any idea what you've done to us? Her husband, red-faced, jabbed a finger toward me. You humiliated your own family tonight. You've turned us into the town's circus. I stood by the window, silent, while my grandson sat slouched on the couch, arms folded, face hardened in sullen defiance. He said nothing, but his eyes carried no regret, only the stubbornness of youth unwilling to admit fault. And then a softer voice broke through. My youngest daughter, who had sat quietly all this time, finally spoke. "No," she said, steady, trembling but sure. "He didn't humiliate us, we humiliated him." The room froze. "What did you just say?" her sister snapped. "You heard me," she replied, turning to face them all. "We stood there while Dad nearly drowned. We laughed. We told him to stop being sensitive. And now we're mad at him for telling the truth. Maybe it's time we looked at ourselves." My son-in-law scoffed. "Oh, don't be dramatic. He's fine. He was rescued. No harm done." "No harm," she shot back, tears welling in her eyes. "You think dignity isn't harm? You think betrayal doesn't leave scars? I was ashamed tonight, but not because of him, because of us." The words cracked open something raw in the room. One side clung tighter to denial, raising voices, defending the boy upstairs. The other side, quieter but firmer, began to shift, their shame surfacing like a wound long ignored. The house filled with noise, accusations, defenses, tears. And silence layered over each other until it no longer sounded like family, but like strangers shouting across a widening chasm. And through it all, I sat in my chair, Kane resting at my side, listening, not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with sorrow. Because a family divided is not just a house filled with voices. It is a house with no heart. And that night, under one roof, I realized the crack in the foundation was no longer hidden. It had split us wide open. The invitation came not through paper or ink, but through whispers that spread faster than wildfire. By the weekend, every porch light in town seemed to know there would be a meeting at the church hall, not about politics, not about zoning laws or harvest schedules, but about us, about my family. When we arrived, the place was already full. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the floor, neighbors clutching thermoses of coffee, arms crossed tight against their chests. The pastor, usually a gentle man who spoke only of forgiveness, stood at the front with a face drawn into solemn lines. It was not a sermon that brought them here, it was justice. "Tonight," the pastor began, "we speak not as judges, but as a community. We've seen the video, we've heard the excuses, but silence can no longer live here. This family must face what happened, not behind closed doors, but here with all of us." My daughter shifted in her seat. Pale and trembling, my son-in-law's jaw clenched. My grandson stared down at the floor, knuckles white. One by one, neighbors rose. Mrs. Henderson, who had known me for 50 years, spoke first. "I watched that video. I saw him pushed. I saw the laughter, and I asked myself, if this can happen to him, a man who gave everything for his family, then what hope is there for the rest of us elders? We deserve respect, not ridicule." Mr. Lewis, the retired mechanic, followed. "I raised my grandkids. If one of them had done what yours did, I'd have dragged him by the ear to apologize before the sun set. Instead, you people sat quiet, and now you sit quiet still. That's not parenting, that's cowardice." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. Then came the petition. A young woman stood, holding a clipboard stacked with pages, signatures flowing across them like waves. 5,000 people, she said firmly, have demanded accountability, and we, as his neighbors, will not let this be swept under the rug. My daughter's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "It wasn't meant to be cruel, it was. Cruelty doesn't need intention," someone interrupted from the back. "It needs action," and he acted, and you laughed. The weight of those words pressed down on the hall until it felt suffocating. Finally, the pastor raised his hand. "This is not about destroying a boy's life," he said softly. "It is about rebuilding what has been broken. Tonight we ask, no, we require that you acknowledge the wrong and that you apologize to the man who has given you life, shelter, and years of sacrifice." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me, but this time it was not my turn to speak, it was theirs. And as the pause stretched, the tension coiled tighter, every second demanding a choice, defend their pride or bow their heads before the truth. That night, under the fluorescent lights of the community hall, the fracture in our family was no longer private. It was on display, raw and undeniable. The world outside had demanded justice, and now the community demanded repentance. The silence in the church hall grew so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every gaze shifted, not to me this time, not to my daughter or her husband, but to the boy slouched in the front row. My grandson. His arms were folded across his chest, head low, but his jaw was tight with the kind of stubbornness only youth can carry. For a moment I thought he might outlast the stares, that he might sit there in silence until the crowd tired. But the community did not blink. "Look up, son, mister," Lewis's gravelly voice called from the back. "Look a man in the eye when you've wronged him." Slowly, almost reluctantly, my grandson raised his head. His eyes darted across the crowd, faces he had known since childhood. The grocer who once gave him candy for free, the teacher who had praised his essays, the neighbor who had fixed his bike chain, and now all of them stared at him with something colder than anger, disappointment. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through next. "Why did you do it? Why would you put your own grandfather in danger?" He swallowed hard, fumbling. "It was just a joke." The word rippled like poison. A dozen voices murmured angrily. Someone near the front shook their head. "A joke," another neighbor snapped. "Jokes don't leave a man gasping for air. Jokes don't break trust." Grandson's cheeks flushed crimson. His bravado cracked, the armor he had worn since that afternoon at the lake beginning to split. Finally, a teenager, one of his own classmates, stood up from the crowd. "You know what they call you at school now?" she asked, her voice trembling but fierce. "They call you the boy who pushed his own blood into the water. That's who you are to us now." The words struck him harder than any slap. His eyes darted to me as if searching for rescue. But I remained still, Cain resting at my side, offering neither shield nor condemnation. The pastor leaned forward, voice steady, almost gentle. "Son, this is your moment. You can keep hiding behind excuses, or you can face what you've done. Which will it be?" The room fell quiet again, all waiting. My grandson's lips trembled, his fists clenched tight against his knees, and then with a sudden crack in his voice, the truth spilled out. "I just wanted them to notice me," he blurted, tears breaking free. "I wanted my friends to think I was strong, funny, not weak. I didn't." His words dissolved into sobs, shoulders shaking. The same boy who had once worn arrogance like a crown now crumbled under the weight of his own confession. And in that raw moment, the hall no longer sounded like a courtroom. It sounded like a mirror, forcing every parent, every grandchild, every neighbor to reflect on how easy it is for cruelty to wear the mask of humor and for respect to vanish in the name of pride. I sat silently, my heart torn between sorrow and something softer. For though my wounds still ached, I saw not just a cruel boy before me, but a child lost in the need to be seen. And sometimes the hardest truth is this: it is not the shove that defines us, but whether we find the courage to admit it was wrong. The hall was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of judgment. It was the heavy pause of a community holding its breath, waiting to see what the boy would do next. My grandson's shoulders shook with sobs, his fists pressed against his knees. For so long he had hidden behind arrogance, behind excuses and laughter, but now the mask had shattered. All that was left was a trembling child, standing on the edge of a choice that would define him. The pastor spoke softly. Almost like a father, "Son, the only way forward is through truth. The only way to heal is to bow lower than your pride will allow." And then it happened. My grandson rose shakily to his feet. His eyes, red, swollen, stripped of defiance, searched the crowd before landing on me. And in that moment, something inside him broke free. He stepped forward, stumbled once, then fell to his knees in front of me. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of words too long unsaid. "I was wrong. I wanted to look strong, but I only showed how weak I really am. I hurt you, I disrespected you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, I'm begging for it." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some wiped their eyes, others nodded, murmuring prayers under their breath. My cane trembled in my hand. To see him kneeling there, my own blood, broken not by water but by his own guilt, was almost too much for my old heart to bear. I reached out slowly, lifting his chin so he would meet my eyes. His tears streamed freely, glistening in the harsh church lights. "You have shamed me," I said quietly, my voice steady, not cruel. "But shame is not the end, it is the beginning if you choose to change." He nodded desperately, unable to speak through his sobs. The room around us seemed to soften. Neighbors who had come seeking punishment now witnessed something rarer: repentance. Not perfect, not polished, but raw, human, and real. I placed my hand on his shoulder, frail, trembling, but enough. "I forgive you," I whispered, so softly that only he and God could hear. And in that instant, the hall erupted, not in applause, but in tears, in sighs of relief, in the quiet recognition that even in the face of betrayal, love can still plant its roots. Because forgiveness, when it comes late, does not erase the wound, but it gives the wound a chance to heal. That night, as we left the hall, my grandson no longer walked ahead with defiance. He walked beside me, his steps uncertain but closer than they had been in years. And for the first time since the water closed over me, I felt something new, not victory, not vindication, but hope. The hall had fallen quiet again after my grandson's apology. His knees still pressed against the wooden floor, his tears soaking into the boards while my hand rested on his shoulder. But something hung in the air, unfinished, like a storm that had passed but left the clouds swollen with more rain. All eyes turned almost instinctively toward the row behind us, toward my children. My eldest daughter, the one who had laughed nervously on the dock, sat rigid. Her hands knotted in her lap. For years she had carried herself with authority, always certain, always in control. But now, under the weight of 100 stares, her composure cracked. I laughed, she whispered. The words came like stones dragged out of her throat. When Dad fell, I laughed. I told myself it was nothing, that it was a joke. But the truth is, I didn't want to face what it really was. I didn't want to face that my son could be cruel. Her voice broke. She covered her face, sobbing. Next came her husband. He stood slowly, clearing his throat, defiance flickering for a moment before dying in the fire of the crowd's gaze. I tried to cover it up, he admitted, voice low. I told all of us that it was just a prank, that Dad was being too sensitive, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was I was ashamed. I didn't want the world to see what had happened in my family, so I lied, and I made the wound deeper. The room was utterly still, the sound of confession heavy and holy. Then, from the far side of the row, my youngest daughter stood. She had been the only one to speak for me at home, the only voice of conscience. Her eyes shimmered with tears as she whispered, and I didn't do enough. I saw it, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't fight harder. I stayed quiet because it was easier. But silence, too, is betrayal. One by one, the walls they had built around themselves crumbled. Pride, denial, excuses, they fell like brittle leaves in autumn, leaving only raw truth behind. I sat in my chair, watching the family I had raised unravel before me, not with anger this time, but with something deeper, sorrow mixed with relief. For truth, no matter how late, is still a kind of mercy. The pastor stepped forward, voice solemn. Tonight, this family has spoken the hardest words a family can speak. We were wrong. And in those words lies the beginning of healing. No healing comes without truth, and no truth comes without courage. Tears filled the eyes of neighbors, friends, strangers. Some reached out, touching my shoulder as if to say, "You are not alone." And for the first time in a long while, I looked at my family, not as the ones who had betrayed me, but as broken souls trying in their clumsy, painful way to put the pieces back together. Because confession does not erase the past, but it opens a door to a different future. That night, the fracture in my family did not vanish, but for the first time, it began to heal. The church hall was still, as if even the old wooden beams above us were leaning in to hear the ending of this storm. My grandson knelt before me, his face streaked with tears, his shoulders trembling from the weight of guilt. Around us, neighbors held their breath, waiting for judgment. My daughter sat weeping, my son-in-law staring at the floor, the shame heavy on them all. And me, my heart was a battlefield between the pain of betrayal and the yearning of love. I looked down at the boy who had once fit in the crook of my arm, who had once clapped his tiny hands when I taught him to skip stones on this very lake. And I saw not only the cruelty of his shove, but also the brokenness of his youth, the desperate hunger to belong, the foolish need to appear strong. Slowly I reached out my hand. The hall gasped when my old fingers touched his wet cheek, lifting his face so our eyes could meet. "My boy," I said. My voice trembling but steady. "A prank can kill a man, but forgiveness," I paused, letting the words sink into the silence. "Forgiveness can save a soul." His eyes widened, tears spilling faster. I tightened my grip on his hand, frail in strength but firm in conviction. "You pushed me down," I continued, "but what matters is whether you rise up different. Don't let this mistake chain you, let it change you." He collapsed forward then, burying his face against my lap, sobbing not with shame but with relief. I felt his tears soak into my clothes, warm and raw, and I placed my hand gently on his back. "I forgive you," I whispered, "not because you deserve it, but because love demands it." Around us the crowd broke. Some cried openly, wiping their eyes. Others bowed their heads, whispering prayers. Even the pastor's voice cracked as he murmured, "Amen." And in that moment the story shifted. What had begun as cruelty and silence had transformed into something else entirely. Not triumph, not punishment, but redemption. Because forgiveness is never weakness. It is the greatest strength an old man can still give to the world. That night, as the hall emptied and my family walked out with heads bowed, I held my grandson's hand tightly in mine. For the first time since the lake swallowed me, I did not feel the weight of betrayal pulling me under. I felt hope lifting me up. The days after the meeting felt different. The air inside the house no longer carried the same sharpness, no longer choked with excuses and raised voices. Instead, there was a quiet humility, an unfamiliar rhythm, but one I had long prayed to hear. My eldest daughter, the one whose laughter had once stung like a blade, began showing up in the mornings. She would sit at the table with me, pour coffee into my mug before her own, and ask, almost timidly, "Did you sleep well?" "Dad," a simple question, one that might seem ordinary to others, but to me it was a balm. For years I had eaten in silence while their voices rushed past me. Now she listened. Her husband, once defiant and defensive, spent afternoons repairing the broken railing on the porch without being asked. I watched him work, sweat on his brow, tools clanging against wood, and though he never said the words aloud, every hammer strike felt like an apology, clumsy but real. And my grandson, the boy who had once shoved me into the cold water, now hovered near me like a shadow. He followed me into the garden, asking questions about the tomatoes and beans I had planted. He carried the heavy watering can before I could protest. One evening, when my knees ached too much to climb the stairs, it was his arm that steadied me, his voice that said softly, "Take your time, Grandpa, I'm right here." It wasn't perfection. Old habits die slow. There were moments when tension flickered, when shame tried to creep back into the room. But each time I saw them catch themselves, pause, breathe, choose differently. Neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Henderson smiled as she passed by, whispering, "I can see it, they're trying now." And I realized forgiveness had not just softened my grandson's heart, it had cracked open the hardened shells of them all. We began to eat dinners together, not with mocking words, but with shared laughter. They asked about my stories, about the days when their mother was young, about how their grandfather used to fish these lakes before dawn. And in those stories, they rediscovered something they had lost, pride in where they came from. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like an old piece of furniture in the corner of the room. I felt like what I truly was, the root of this family tree. And roots, though buried, are what keep the tree alive. The Sunday after my grandson's apology, the town gathered again. This time not for judgment, not for confrontation, but for something different, something rare. The mayor himself had called for it, a day of honor. I did not know what to expect as my daughters escorted me into the town square. The same faces that had once looked at me with pity now shone with something else, respect. The square was draped with banners, not grand or gaudy, but humble ones. Hand-painted by school children, "Respect our elders," "Family means dignity," and in shaky crayon letters one simply said, "We love you, Grandpa." At the center stood a small wooden stage, and as they guided me to it, I felt the weight of eyes on me, not heavy with shame anymore, but light with gratitude. The pastor spoke first, his voice carrying across the square. In every town, there are stories that shame us and stories that shape us. What happened at that lake began as shame, but through truth, confession, and forgiveness, it has become something more, a lesson for us all. Neighbors stepped forward with gifts, not of wealth, but of meaning. Mrs. Henderson brought me a quilt stitched by the women's group, its thread spelling out the words, "Honor the roots." The schoolchildren handed me a book of letters, pages filled with apologies and promises. "I'll treat my grandpa better. I'll listen to my grandma's stories. I won't laugh when old hands tremble." And then the mayor held up a simple plaque carved from local oak. It read, "To Mr. Harland for teaching us that dignity is not demanded but lived, for reminding us that forgiveness is the highest form of strength." The crowd stood, applause rolling like thunder against the mountains that framed our town. My grandson, standing beside me now, clapped until his palms turned red, tears glistening in his eyes. I stood, leaning on my cane, and lifted my hand for quiet. "My friends," I said softly, "I am no hero. I am just an old man who once fell into a lake, but perhaps in that fall we all saw how fragile respect can be, and how precious it is when we choose to give it back." The The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of hearts stirred, of families reflecting, of a community changed. That day I walked home not as a victim of cruelty, but as a bearer of something greater, proof that even the deepest wounds can blossom into lessons for everyone. Because sometimes it takes a single fall to teach an entire town how to stand tall. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. The water that once swallowed me is calm again, reflecting only the sky. The voices that once mocked me have grown quiet, replaced by hands that help me into chairs, by footsteps that slow down to match mine. I think often about that night by the lake, not of the shove nor the laughter, but of the silence that followed. Silence, I've learned, is the heaviest weight of all. And yet, out of that silence came something I never expected: truth, change, forgiveness. You see, families do not fall apart in one moment. They crumble slowly when respect is forgotten, when dignity is taken for granted. And sometimes it takes a fall into cold water to remind everyone just how fragile love really is. But here's what I want you to remember. Forgiveness does not erase pain. It does not undo the past. What it does, what it always does, is give us a future worth living together. When my grandson knelt before me, I did not see the boy who pushed me down. I saw the man he might yet become, the man I prayed he would become. And when my children bowed their heads in shame, I chose not to hold their betrayal against them. Because love, real love, is not measured in how we never fall short, but in how we choose to rise again. So if you are listening to this story tonight, I ask you, look at your own family. Call the parent you've ignored. Hug the grandparent who sits quietly in the corner. Listen to the stories you've heard 1,000 times but never truly heard, because respect is not owed when it's convenient, it is owed always. And perhaps one day when your hair has turned silver and your hands tremble like mine, you will hope someone remembers that lesson too. Thank you for walking with me through this story, if it touched your heart. I invite you to share your thoughts below, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of family, of love, of loss and redemption, please subscribe to this channel. Your presence here means more than you know, because in the end, stories only live when they are shared, and families only heal when we choose to listen.